the whole of what is there. Now, I think if I was, if somebody came up to me and say, tell us a book that would kind of show us what contemporary Trinidad was like, then I would say, well, you should read this collection, 10 Days, the 10 Days Executive. And I would say that not just because of there are some very, very sharp political kind of stories in the thing, but that there are stories that go to the heart of how people live their lives in Trinidad. The people who are, and they're by no means ordinary people, but they're people who are kind of struggling to make meaning, people struggling to make ends meet, people struggling to establish a kind of face in the world. So that, that in terms of, there is a kind of a depth through. So it's both looking at the kind of bigger kind of things that are happening, but it's also a finger on the pulse for how things are happening for ordinary people. And of course, one of the things that happens in the stories is that you'd recognise that men and women often try and find their meanings in different kinds of ways, and sometimes in conflicting ways. And one of the things I really like about the stories here is that there is a kind of a real even-handedness. So that one of the things that happens is that the male stupidity does feature, but also that one sees that whether it's male or female, there is the same kind of humane recognition of flaws. We're all flawed. We're all trying to put our face into the world in some kind of way. So that's one of the things I really liked. I mean, as a kind of a male reader, that there is a kind of there's an evenness of look in terms of that. Now, the other kind of thing is to say that it's a very kind of varied collection. So that it's a collection which has its dark moments, it has its moments of real bright comedy. And anybody, one of the things, if any of you have heard Rhoda read before, you'll know she is a brilliant listener. She hears voices brilliantly well, and she's brilliant at recording those voices. So one of the real strengths of the collection is that it's told in a whole number of different voices, different narrators, each with a different voice, whether they're men, whether they're women, whether they're people who are troubled, whether they're people who are confident, whether they're male, female, whether young, old, and so on. So there is that kind of sort of variety. One of the other things I think is really great about the stories is how they go inside of things. There's a story in the collection called The Fairest of Them All. And it's a story about incest inside a family, the dark subject. And when I read the story the first time, I was reminded of a story I'd read a long, long time ago by another Trinidadian writer. And probably whether you remember, there's a writer called Enid Lewis, I've never met her, never heard anything of her, who wrote this quite powerful collection of stories. This is back in the 1970s, you can tell how old I am, who wrote this story, I think, called Voices of Earth. And there's a story in there called Bat Nana, which is about incest within a family. But there's a major difference between that kind of story and the story that Rhoda does. And the difference is about being outside and inside. The Enid Lewis story is from outside, it's somebody who's looking in, and there's a slightly kind of moralistic look at this situation. What's brilliant about Rhoda's story is it's told totally from the inside. So it's told from the point of view of the three children in that household. And the story emerges through the gaps between each one of them and what they each understand, and the limited understanding. And it's a story which is told totally in their voices. And I think when you read, you will hear how authentically true those are to children's voices and to the kind of dialogues that occur within that kind of domestic space. So that those are kind of going from inside. But there's also kind of, there's some rich humour. One of my favourite stories in the collection. I mean, there are lots of different ones in there. But there's one brilliant story called Redemption, and this is one of those stories about where you see the kind of equality that is registered between sort of men and women. Redemption is set in this village, and at one end of the village, I'll have to put my glasses on for a second. If I'd have had my iPad, I could have done this with great ease. But right. So in this village, which is called, there are two places. There is the New Testament Revival Tabernacle, and at the other end of the village, but just 10 houses away, is the Sunrise Palace Hotel and Bar. Now, if you were naive, you might wonder why a little village has a hotel. Who stays in this hotel? Well, you discover that in fact who stays in the hotel, and they only stay for very brief periods in the hotel, are the men in the village. And there is this lovely, I'm not going to read anymore because you have to read this story yourself, which means you have to buy the book, right? So there's this lovely kind of line in the poem about the proximity between these two places. I'll just say again, the hotel is where the men have their domain. The church is where the women have their domain, although the men are dragged along somewhat unwillingly to make their confessions. And there's a nice line about the way that the pastor of the Redemption Tabernacle has to learn not to raise the kind of iniquities of the men, because they won't come and they won't put any money in the congregation plate. So there's this lovely line, the little sentence. So it says, "So is nothing strange to hear cries like, 'Sweet Jesus!' or 'Oh God!' in both buildings," as folk raise their voices in a crescendo of praise to the gifts of life given by their Maker. So I hope that's a line which would sell the book to me, yeah. And so there is. I could, I'm not going to go any further because you want to hear Rhoda reading, but say it's a book I'm immensely proud to have published. I love working with Rhoda on it and seeing it move to fruition. The other thing I would say about it, because he's sitting there, is as well. I mean, you might be tempted to think that what you've got here are kind of slices of life, but they are really, really well-shaped stories. They begin, they end, and they end in the right kind of place. They're economical stories, and what I would say is that they are a brilliant. I mean, they start with Rhoda's talent, but I also know that the guy who is sitting next to Rhoda, Funso with his MFA course at the university, it's a very, very good kind of advertisement for the good work that course has done in teaching the basics of the craft of writing good short fiction. So it has all those kinds of merits. And I think that I just about said everything I've got written down on the thing, which is a bit of a miracle. So, Rhoda.